All right, yes, it definitely is a slightly provocative title, but it's something that's actually practical. So I'm an entrepreneur, and I love trying to figure out what's the future so that we can plan ahead of time. A little bit of background on myself. So we recently started the Libreum Research Institute a few years ago as a exciting approach to figuring out how the practicality of agent-based modeling, using a lot of the technologies over the coming 5 years or so, make it more practical, especially combining it with machine learning, deep neural networks. But as many of you know, ABM, it becomes really difficult to process huge amounts of information, simulating millions, if not billions, of individual agents and their outcomes. So we've created this, and we love working with Nessie and creating a community of other ABM enthusiasts who also want to make it more practical. So High Financial Systems is a tech company that we've used agent-based modeling. Sandeep and I have helped start that company about 4 years ago. And a couple decades ago, we both actually were classmates at Georgia Tech when agent-based modeling was extremely simple, straightforward algorithms, but not as useful and not as practical. But after Georgia Tech, we helped build a financial institution doing a lot of modeling techniques. I went back and have been lecturing in quantitative computational finance for over, I think, almost 15 years now. I had a master's and PhD program, and that's my cheap way of recruiting awesome students to work at different companies. I also lecture at Georgia State's actual science program. And we've advised and worked with and communicated about agent-based modeling more from a preventative standpoint for the Department of Defense, both in the United States and several other countries, to figure out how we can create positive solutions for the future. Sandeep?
Thank you, JP. My name is Sandeep Prabhakara. Thank you, and good morning, everybody. My background has been in healthcare finance, not dissimilar to JP's as well, but sort of fundamental underpinning of the work that I've done has been more from an analytics standpoint, and especially as it relates to agent-based modeling. And with some of the work and why this topic is particularly relevant, again, it seems so far away from where we are today to talk about conflicts and wars. In many cases, because so much of the focus is on the virus, but with some of the work that we are doing as part of the institute, with some of the folks that we work with in there, that's a very pertinent question. I think some of our folks are looking beyond the next 1 year, 2 years, and to truly understand what could some of the downstream effects be of a virus like this in terms of conflicts and the decisions that can help drive in terms of resource allocation, in terms of military, in terms of infrastructure. I think these are the sort of questions we're getting. And by the nature of it, these are fairly long-term discussions that we have with them. This is not a 1 to 2 year discussion. This is more about over 5 years and even beyond that, and how you think about that, right? Where the data are sparse, the data are uncertain, there's so much we don't know about it. And so the question is, in that time frame, how do we sort of think about it? And that's been the genesis of the Research Institute itself. Obviously, there are many organizations out there today who are doing agent-based modeling simulations and stuff like that. I think that the reason why we wanted to come to this sphere and the differentiation that we bring are twofold. One, thinking about just the time frame itself, I think this is less about the 1 to 2 year, although it does matter. It's more the 4 to 5 and beyond that, and how we think about the frameworks, the data, the infrastructure, how we figure that out. And two, we are very experimental in that we will go out there, collect data, we do micro experiments all the time. So not just relying on the information that's available out there. We do go out and collect specific kind of data that we need in order to model these scenarios out and stuff like that as well. So again, we're trying to be full service from that perspective. And again, a very relevant topic for us has been around conflicts, and especially given the history of similar situations with the plagues and stuff like that, and what it has caused. This is a very relevant topic for a lot of our customers.
Perfect. So, like Sandeep was saying, especially as an entrepreneur, you can't plan for what's going to happen next year. Next year is already done. In fact, the next few years are kind of done. Yes, there's uncertainty, but the key is, can you get years ahead in advance? Can you figure out where the marketplace is going? Can you figure out where the world is going? and what are the underlying factors that influence that. Obviously, right now we're in the middle of a financial collapse, but the actual impact isn't completely felt yet. It takes a little bit of time to do that. But what's been brewing even before anything happened in the virus was this sense of nationalism of a lot of countries, a lot more inward looking, a lot less global trade. And it's been moving in a direction that is causing a cultural conflicts. And we'll talk about this a little bit. One of my favorite books, Clash of Civilizations, will reference it. But understanding how different cultures view the world and each other is also a major factor in understanding how wars get started. It's not just one thing or another. It's a lot of these things. So a long time ago, in 535 AD, there was this major extreme weather effect that ended up happening. It's theoretically, I've heard historians say 535, that area of time in history was the worst of all time in history, because not only were there extreme weather effects, mainly potentially from volcanoes and other activity, but there was this cooling of the world. And what ended up happening is major crop failures of a lot of these developed civilizations like Rome. And when you have a high supply chain and interconnected economy, these cause a lot of other problems, right? So if you've got crop failures and you're running out of supplies, then the actual state of the individual ends up becoming weaker, causing other types of diseases to happen, similar to like the bubonic plague. This whole plague of Justinian, it didn't even just start and end after a few years. It was 2 centuries of on and off plague that wiped out approximately 50% of the European population at that time. So obviously we've talked about other types of viruses and other types of pandemics, but this is, I think, from a historical written standpoint, the first major uncontrollable cyclical pandemic. Now, it's one thing to just study the pandemic. It's another thing to understand what are the other effects of it, especially in terms of conflict, in terms of the well-being of a civilization, the development or the lack of development of a civilization. These are things that we've actually been able to carefully study from these types of situations in the past. So another one that we talked about earlier is this whole concept of Clash of Civilization. Really fantastic book. The general gist is you have all these different religious, philosophical, maybe even language-based differences between different societies. And when there are things like pandemics or financial collapses, you start to see where there is natural tensions, natural alliances, both historical and long-term, that end up creating these friction points in society. Now, the pandemic, the news, everything else, you put it into this pot, but really the way to look at it, and we'll look at it in more detail coming up, is what's the individual's impact and behavior so that you can actually model it from a ground up and what that's going to do from a top-down standpoint. So most recently, from a conflict standpoint, you've got this regional Arab Spring. And was Arab Spring just because of differences or inequality? No, there's too many factors that you have to take into consideration. One major factor, in fact, that gets thrown out there, Jared Diamond wrote this book on collapse, where as the local population gets to X%, I've heard about 40% of your income is going towards just food, it's a tipping point for collapse as a society, because you get to this point where there's kind of a, why are we giving everything we possibly can just to barely survive? And so looking and studying underlying factors like this can also get you to understand how the pandemic is potentially creating a situation that's going to cause greater impact than even the Arab Spring.
Great. So just to set up the rest of the slides here as well, one of the things we wanted to do was, yes, we can talk a lot about the model and we'll talk about elements of the model itself, but just to even think about the virus itself and the potential conflict zones today, just to give a sense for where it's happening, right? We've seen different maps typically more focused on the virus today. I think that major outbreak centers aren't a surprise to anyone with North America, South America, especially in the subcontinent going on. But it's pretty instructive as we talk to a lot of our clients as well to think about how close these are geopolitically to some of the conflict zones there as well, right? And I think some of these things are, if you look at the subcontinent where major outbreak is, whether it's the Indo-Pakistan, the Indo-China conflicts, for example, right, on the South China Sea conflicts, for example, or in the Middle East, especially where there's a confluence of outbreaks of the pandemic along with various conflict zones, right? And as it relates to U.S. critical interests as well, right? So a lot of our focus has been on understanding or narrowing down rather where should our focus be, right? Just given the breadth of it, war is such a complex topic, you don't know quite where it starts from. And think about the virus, think about the conflict. Usually the first thing we end up doing is to piece on a map together and see where some global centers, for example, right? So I think a lot of our focus today is Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, and to track some of the migration patterns that are happening because of the virus and some of the geopolitical issues, especially as they're important, right? And we'll hit on this a little bit more as we go along, because beyond just the data itself, one of the fundamental things that we see is our ability to incorporate some of these higher order psychological factors, the cultural factors, and to bring back a more agent-based modeling approach in order to be able to say something about the future.
So the way I kind of want to set it up is, yes, there's been these conflicts in the past. Yes, we've seen pandemics. Yes, we've seen riots. We've seen world wars. And there are some similarities to all these. But what's unfortunate is that there's this sense of inevitability with a lot of these things. So many of you have seen the TED Talk that Bill Gates talked about, warning of a pandemic, and that didn't do enough. So this is a person that's leading a foundation that's got maybe 100 billion plus in assets to be able to direct it, connections with every major government, every political major situation globally. But that's not even remotely enough to be even prepared for a pandemic. I wrote in this Isaac Asimov and Foundation series, so I actually got excited. I didn't call it agent-based modeling. In the book series, they called it psychohistory with Harry Seldon. But this concept of being able to understand how individuals are going to behave is more important than can possibly be understood, even more than just saying this is going to happen in the future. Because if you're going to actually do something about it, you got to know what's expected to happen at the individual level, building that model from the ground up, and then what are the things that you need to do to prevent it. Right now, I'll tell you, when we started looking at this data actually before the actual pandemic even hit, we were already not very positive of the direction and even the timing of what was happening. We're going to go through some of the stuff that got us to understand that.
So the next couple of slides, what we want to do is quickly talk a little bit about the fundamental frameworks that we've used in order to model some context like that. Right, so I think when we think about agent-based modeling, the data itself, the first question that we always get is, hey, what should we be looking into? Something is as complex and broad as war, right? What should we be focusing on? And when it comes to our models, one of the things that we've thought about is, two broad buckets. So there's fundamental forces, and you can get the next hour as well, the higher order forces as well. So if you think about conflict, usually the entire narrative is on the right-hand side, right? Civil rights, justice, the culture, the morality, the religion, especially things like that. But fundamentally, we all know there's a strong connection between what's the bottom part of Maslow's hierarchy itself, right? How do we think about food? How do we think about land, reproduction, debt, water resources, energy consumption, stuff like that? And so as we model some of these things, a lot of our focus, our experiments has been on the left side, which is trying to understand within certain parts of the country or certain parts of the globe, what does resource utilization look like, right? What does the water consumption look like? How is that changing given the environment, given the virus, for example, right? What is the impact it's having on birth rate, for example? And these are the kind of information that we are able to bring together and then tie that to some of these higher order implications, such as justice, culture, and stuff like that, to use this model framework to create a model for it. Give me the next one. And I want to hit on a couple of other things which I think as we've built out these long-term models have been fundamentally extremely important for us. One is the psychology itself. So even if you think about the virus itself, and there have been plenty of models, we've built plenty of models, I'm sure people on here have built many more models as well. Yes, there's an epidemiology, I think, to look into all that, but fundamentally for it to be practical and how we address this issue, it's also about the psychology of the people itself, right? And that is a key factor that is very variable susceptible to manipulation, media, information, so many other things. And so that's a key factor of how we bring in. There are two ways of thinking about it. One is, on the left, as we see here, are just some fundamental biases that exist from the history, right, of having looked at various plagues and wars and conflicts, so the kind of biases that come into picture. And so for these, we're actually able to do some micro experiments to figure out which of them are prevalent within a certain part of the country, right, or part of the globe. And on the right, if you think about it, this idea of prospect theory, and this is obviously very well known, the Kahneman. And the idea here is not just to think about tipping points, which are important, but the regimes in which people think, right? Because your bias on how people react is fundamentally dependent upon the framing of the situation itself. And so with a lot of our clients, beyond just giving them tools to figure out what are the different levers that they can play with, it's the framing of the situation, whether it's a gain or a loss, or it's a high probability, low probability, and the impact it has on the psyche of the agents in the population itself. The next one that we get oftentimes is, hey, what are the models that we use? And I think, Lena, you had referred this as well in your prior discussion, which is, it's not one model, there are many, many models out there, and sometimes it's not the model itself that's important. I think it's the foundation of how you construct the model, the information that you have that really provides a sense for it. And for a lot of these models out there, for us, yes, there's a model in interaction with the environment, but we like to think of even within the agent itself, right? How do we bring in the hierarchy out there, for example, right? So how do we look at the fundamental factors that impact on the overall psyche, and how does it all relate to the environment itself? I think that's where the challenge of these models lie, and that's what we're trying. And the next point, again, just in the interest of time, that given the simulations that we've done and the work that we've done as well, there are typically 9 functional elements of the model that we've seen are very important as far as understanding what are the levers that can be used in order to impact the current situation itself, right? If you think about agent-based models, a lot of the discussion typically is around the agent, the interaction it has, and the frequency of the interaction, for example. But there's so many other things when it comes to a model like that are equally, or if not more important, right? So I'm going to hit those quickly and give you a couple of examples here, right? So when you think about typical models, the number of interactions, the frequency, again, that makes a lot of sense. What about the safety of the interaction itself, right? Can that be leveraged to make an impact on the actual dynamics of it? What about the quality of the connection itself, right? So here's where you see governments use information, misinformation to in fact break the quality of the connection across teams itself. There's a hierarchy of interactions. Oftentimes when we see in global conflict, it's not just individual agents working together, but there's also a hierarchy between the agents and the leadership structure itself. Right? And then there are a few other things I'll hit: the nature of the interaction, the packed dependence of the interaction itself. And here you see conflicts such as the most recent conflict we modeled was around the Kashmir conflict. A potential conflict was expected with some of the decisions made by the Indian government, and how they were able to bypass or prevent certain locations, certain geographical areas in order to prevent the conflict from further worsening into riots and stuff like that, right? And then finally, the reinforcement of an interaction is equally important. Very hard to model, because as agents, we don't operate within vacuum, right? We are looking at our group, our peak of people, in order to understand how our behavior should be, and that's a reinforcement that needs to come. And finally, the signature of it itself. To think about the virus today, one of the things that has made it really hard is the spread when people are asymptomatic, right? In some ways, a lot of the symptoms, some of the viruses before have been very symptomatic and be able to contain very quickly. There's a situation where it has a longer incubation period, which means it can spread without a strong signature, right? So again, the idea is, when you think like the virus, can we build off of that to truly understand how we impact global conflicts?
So the way we want to look at it is, we've got huge amounts of data. I remember when we were students, we had our laptops or desktops with very low amounts of power to run these kind of simulations. Then, from an academic standpoint, we could use some of the university infrastructure. And, as you start scaling it up, there's more and more and more data that you have to take into consideration with a lot of these types of things. When we're modeling a lot of this global economic collapse data, one of the references that I love using is trading economics. There's great APIs for data sets that we can use in there that do global economic factors. From an individual standpoint, as we're understanding their collapse, we're in the financial space on the consumer side, understanding consumer financial data, purchasing behavior data, credit bureau data, gives us a good understanding of how poorly is a population on a country or regional basis doing things like unemployment. A major factor that we look at as a leading indicator is how many kids who are able to get a job below the age of 30 are sitting on the sideline. In the US alone, right now, there's 3 out of 10 kids that should be, that have the ability to work that are unemployed right now. So if you look at that from a global standpoint in different regions, those numbers are even more catastrophic. That allows it to kind of build up this mass fear. And that's where the problems start to begin. And at that point, there's almost it's too late to do anything about it, because once you've got countries that are ill-equipped financially or otherwise to deal with the virus that's going on right now, we've run a lot of these simulations of what does it take for a country or a region or even parts of a country to collapse, where things like riots, things like morality, things like law of order start to break down, no matter how strict it is. In fact, in some of these cases, as you guys have seen on the news, the tighter some of the constraints end up becoming, the worse the situation ends up being. And so studying a lot of this gives us the ability to figure out what does it take for regional conflict to happen. There's this crazy word that I say is this rise of the saviors. So if you look through history, when you have this mass fear, economic collapse, you have characters in society who end up saying, I'm going to save my people. And you have these kind of mass focus behind individuals. It is very hard to model these things, but I'll tell you, today versus even a couple decades ago when we were looking at a lot of these types of modeling techniques, a lot easier and in some cases a lot scarier. That being said, I would say even for agent-based modeling simulation to get really more from an accuracy standpoint, being able to take a huge amount of data, I think we're still about 5 years away from being able to see a lot of that technology mature. That being said, there is another way. Now, we don't think, yes, we think a lot of this stuff is inevitable, but maybe there are ways that we can use the existing systems that we have to prevent war in the future. But right now, looking at even how World War II developed, we're in a lot of situation 10 years in advance, plus or minus. So instead of thinking of military as a way of conflict, one of the things that we've recommended to different agencies is say, yes, you've got certain standards that you need to maintain, but what if we could recruit some of those kids that are on the streets that don't have jobs more for peacekeeping operations regionally with allies, so that you can help build infrastructure, rebuild infrastructure that's suffering, and actually help a lot of people in the process. The other thing is, whenever you've got major economies such as like China and the United States in conflict, even with the whole Hong Kong situation as being a neutral trade point, it can shift over. So countries like Singapore can be a neutral trade point to actually reduce conflict. So that's where the countries don't really have to stop their war of trade, but what they can do is redirect a lot of that energy through neutral trade countries that are able to respect both sides of the equation. Another one is internal infrastructure development. Similar to what happened in the Great Depression, you've got a lot of people, a lot of labor sitting on the side. Countries like the United States in the Great Depression, and even China as it's been building, and a lot of other countries, even in Africa, who are in development, they're able to actually focus a lot of their energy on internal infrastructure development. One, it can put a large percentage of the population to work. It's been proven to be successful in the past, and it actually is a win-win for the population and actually developing the country for future potential. Sandeep, can you talk about bottom-up incentives?
Yeah, sure. I'll do it very quickly for the sake of time as well. And this is something that's already being implemented in some situations here as well. And the idea here is there a way to incentivize our people less, right? So they're actually doing behavior very relevant to their situation today. So when it comes to the virus or the conflict, right? One example has been around, removing some of the regulations around people moving across state lines, especially because their jobs today are very focused in city centers, right? And people are moving away to these normal, very natural family or friendship group cliques, for example. And when we model that, we've seen that, hey, the diversity that cities bring in oftentimes can be very detrimental to our controlling a personal virus standpoint, but allowing people to move into groups that they're actually comfortable with, are similar culturally, similar in terms of the way they think about from a psychology standpoint, has been a huge impact where it has been successfully implemented. Now, one high-level example of that is countries themselves, right? Countries are natural, in some ways, political boundaries where the culture is consistent compared to other countries. And there have been differences across countries. And so can we take that idea and apply it to more of an individual level where, letting people move across state lines, working from different places, incentivizing some of that so that they are naturally forming these small clusters which are a lot more powerful against the virus as opposed to individually being forced to be in different situations and stuff like that.
Well, that pretty much concludes our presentation. I think in finality, beyond just learning lessons from what's been happening in society right now, we can actually use the virus perspective to solve a lot of these problems potentially in the future and avoid any type of major military conflict or even regional conflict. Now we're done and open for questions.